If you truly want to bring a change in your life, then make sure you watch this video till the end. Because sometimes, a small idea, a single thought, can change your entire life. And whatever you're going to hear in this video, if you honestly implement even one thing from it, then believe me, your life can change. So please, watch the full video without skipping. And if you enjoy powerful book summaries and life-changing content like this, then like the video, subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to comment what book or topic you want to see next. Let's get started.
If you look at a blueprint for a suspension bridge, there is this comforting expectation of just absolute precision.
Right, because it's structural engineering. You calculate the live load, you
Yeah.
measure the tensile strength of the cables, and the math just works.
Exactly. It's binary. You point at the schematic and say, that structure will hold exactly this much weight. It's clean.
And predictable.
Yeah.
Because gravity doesn't wake up feeling unappreciated, right? Wind resistance doesn't have an ego that you have to delicately navigate.
Yeah, and we crave that determinism.
Yeah.
We really do. We organize our modern businesses and our routines around the expectation that inputs will neatly align with outputs.
But then you step out of the realm of physical engineering and into, well, the reality of human interaction.
Right. You try to manage a newly formed team, or navigate a tense dynamic in a marriage, or just de-escalate a conflict with a frustrated client. So
Suddenly that deterministic blueprint is entirely useless.
completely useless. You just can't put human ego into a spreadsheet.
So today in our deep dive, we are reverse engineering the most complex, volatile piece of machinery on Earth.
The people around you.
Exactly. We are looking at a fascinating stack of historical notes, behavioral studies, and psychological excerpts drawn from Dale Carnegie's foundational work on human relations.
And it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. Because the problem most of us face is that we try to apply the rules of logic to entities that are fundamentally driven by emotion.
We treat humans like they're algorithms.
Right, expecting rational inputs to yield rational outputs. But the underlying mechanics are governed by an entirely different set of rules.
And before we get into the psychology of those rules, I was looking at the origins of this material, and there's a staggering piece of research from the Carnegie Foundation.
The one that completely shatters how we value professional skills. Yes. They conducted this massive longitudinal study looking at the root causes of financial and professional success. And you would naturally assume that in highly complex, data-driven fields, success would be proportional to technical genius.
It's the standard meritocratic assumption, right? You master the technical mechanics, and the market rewards you.
But the data tells a wildly different story. It showed that even in technical professions like engineering, only about 15% of a person's financial success is due to their technical knowledge.
Just 15%.
Right. The other 85% is entirely due to skill in human engineering.
And if you look closely at that 85% statistic, it highlights this profound evolutionary mismatch. I mean, we spent decades in school optimizing for that 15%.
Memorizing formulas, learning to code.
Exactly. But technical proficiency is essentially just table stakes. It gets you in the door. The differentiating factor is entirely dependent on your mastery of human friction.
Okay, let's unpack this, because what I find so compelling is the historical context. This wasn't written by an academic theorist isolated in an ivory tower.
No, it was born out of a literal 15-year adult laboratory of human relationships in New York City.
Back in the 1930s, they conducted a survey across a massive demographic of adults, spending $25,000 on it, which was an astronomical sum during the Great Depression.
Just to find out what adults fundamentally wanted to learn.
And the number one interest was health. But their number two interest was people.
How to understand them, how to avoid conflict with them.
But there wasn't a practical textbook for that. Psychology at the time was all psychoanalysis, so Carnegie essentially had to invent the curriculum in real time.
Using his adult education classes as a testing ground, businessmen would come in at night, learn a principle, apply it the next morning, and report back.
Trial and error. And the publishers originally thought it was a niche project. They expected to sell maybe 5,000 copies.
Instead, it became an international phenomenon because it attacks the core of our daily existence.
So if 85% of our trajectory relies on human engineering, we first need to figure out what kind of fuel this human engine actually runs on.
To understand the fuel, we have to look at our baseline psychological drivers. Sigmund Freud argued it was the sex urge and the desire to be great.
But John Dewey, the American philosopher, distilled it into something slightly different. He stated that the deepest urge in human nature is desire to be important.
And we have to be careful not to conflate that with mere vanity. William James called it the craving to be appreciated.
It's an unfaltering biological hunger.
Exactly. It's the defining characteristic that separates human consciousness from animals. Animals have survival instincts, but humans possess this abstract need for significance.
It's why we build empires. There's actually a brilliantly grounded example in our sources about a farmer who bred pedigreed hogs.
Oh, the blue ribbon story.
Yeah, he would win first prize blue ribbons at country fairs, and he pinned them to a white muslin sheet. Whenever guests came over, he would bring out the sheet and proudly display the ribbons.
The fascinating part is, the hogs obviously had no concept of the ribbons.
Right, they didn't care at all.
But the farmer did. The ribbons gave him a tangible metric of his own importance.
And it's a microcosm of human civilization. It's why people buy luxury vehicles or insist on specific designer labels.
Or consider John D. Rockefeller. He amassed incomprehensible wealth, yet he continued to build modern hospitals in places like Peking, China, for millions of impoverished people he'd never meet.
It wasn't just altruism.
No, it was a mechanism to fulfill his craving for monumental importance on a global scale.
But the pursuit of importance isn't inherently noble. Our notes point out a much darker reality. If an individual can't find a socially acceptable avenue to feel important, they will often resort to violent behavior.
The sources mention that young criminals frequently clip newspaper articles about their own crimes.
Yeah, they want to see their names in print alongside sports stars. The underlying biological urge is identical to Rockefeller, just pathologically distorted.
Which brings us to a vital analytical pivot. If human beings are entirely governed by this fragile need to feel valued, we have to evaluate the tools we instinctively use when interacting with them.
And the most common tool we reach for when someone fails is criticism.
We use it constantly. We think it's corrective feedback.
We think logic will take over.
But neurobiologically, criticism is perceived as a threat. It punctures that delicate balloon of importance.
It triggers the amygdala.
Exactly. A fight-or-flight response. The person goes on the defensive, and their cognitive resources are diverted to justifying their own actions.
The sources have this mind-blowing historical case study that illustrates just how impenetrable that self-justification is. Let's look at Two Gun Crowley.
A notorious, ruthless killer in New York in the 1930s.
Right. He's parked on a country road with his girlfriend. A police officer walks up, asks to see his license, and Crowley just draws his weapon and shoots the officer at point-blank range.
Doesn't say a single word.
Then leaps out, grabs the dying officer's revolver, and shoots him again. Unprovoked sociopathy.
Pure cold-blooded murder.
So shortly after, the police track him to an apartment in Manhattan. It becomes the most chaotic manhunt in the city's history. 150 police officers, machine guns on the roofs, tear gas.
10,000 spectators watching.
And Crowley is barricaded inside, actively bleeding from police gunfire. And as he is trapped there, leaving a literal trail of blood on the paper, he writes a letter.
You'd expect a confession.
But he writes, "Under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm."
The cognitive gymnastics required to write that while actively engaging in a lethal shootout is staggering.
It's the absolute ceiling of the human ego. When he was sent to the death house in Sing Sing, his narrative was unbroken. He said, "This is what I get for defending myself."
He genuinely believed he was the victim. And he wasn't an anomaly. Al Capone viewed himself as an unappreciated public benefactor.
Dutch Schultz said the exact same thing. Warden Lewis Laws from Sing Sing noted that almost none of the inmates regarded themselves as bad people.
They completely rationalized their actions. And this is where we need to draw a direct line to our own lives.
What's fascinating here is, if the most violent criminals possess an ego defense mechanism so robust that it shields them from self-blame, how can we expect a mid-level manager or a teenager to accept our criticism without getting defensive?
Precisely. If Al Capone can look at a trail of bodies and convince himself he's a philanthropist, why do we think yelling at an employee is going to make them say, "Your logic is flawless, I am entirely at fault"?
It's absurd. They're just going to internally blame the timeline or the software.
B.F. Skinner proved this through operant conditioning. An animal rewarded for positive behavior learns exponentially faster than an animal punished for negative behavior.
And it's the same in human neurobiology. Criticism doesn't stimulate behavioral change, it stimulates resentment.
As Hans Selye noted, human beings thirst for approval just as intensely as we dread condemnation.
Let's look at the political scale. The Teapot Dome scandal. Albert B. Fall, Secretary of the Interior under Harding, secretly leased government oil reserves to his friend for a massive loan.
Then used U.S. Marines to drive competing prospectors off the land.
A staggering abuse of power. He was sent to prison, but did he ever repent?
Maintained his absolute innocence until his death.
Years later, Herbert Hoover implied that President Harding's death was accelerated by Fall's betrayal. Fall's wife heard that, leapt from her chair, and screamed that her husband was the one who had been unjustly crucified.
The ego operating at maximum defensive capacity. Criticism always returns to the sender.
But the desire to criticize is so ingrained. Take Abraham Lincoln. We view him as the ultimate diplomat, but as a young man, he was notoriously caustic.
He wrote mocking poems and dropped them on country roads to humiliate his neighbors.
Weaponizing his intellect. And he carried that into his political career until he published an anonymous letter lampooning an Irish politician named James Shields,
who was highly sensitive.
Right.
Shields tracked down the true author and challenged Lincoln to a duel.
And duels were lethal? Lincoln didn't want to fight, but to save his honor, he chose cavalry broadswords.
Because of his long arms.
Right. They were literally standing on a sandbar in the Mississippi River, ready to hack each other to death. At the last second, their seconds negotiated a truce.
That brush with pointless death forced a permanent recalibration of his interpersonal strategy.
He realized intellectual superiority only breeds lethal resentment. And this was put to the test during the Civil War. General Lee was retreating after Gettysburg and was trapped at the flooded Potomac River.
Lincoln sees a heaven-sent opportunity. If General Meade attacks, the war ends immediately.
So Lincoln orders Meade to attack immediately, explicitly telling him not to convene a council of war.
And what does Meade do? Paralyzes himself with caution, disobeys the order, convenes the council, and refuses to attack.
And Lee escapes. So Lincoln is overwhelmed with fury and drafts a devastating letter to Meade saying, "I am distressed immeasurably because of your failure."
It's a completely justified critique.
But the twist is, Meade never read it, because Lincoln never sent it.
Lincoln paused and ran a simulation of the psychological outcome. He realized Meade would just retreat into defensive self-justification and blame the weather or his troops.
It would impair Meade's future utility.
Exactly. Even when criticism is objectively accurate, its practical application almost invariably ends in futility.
But wait, I have to interject here. If we never criticize, how do we fix mistakes? Are we just supposed to let people pour jet fuel into our airplanes?
The Bob Hoover story.
Right. Hoover is a test pilot performing in a vintage propeller plane. The engines fail midair, he crash lands, survives, and finds out the mechanic used jet fuel instead of gasoline.
A potentially lethal, inexcusable error.
So my pushback is, if we don't prioritize their ego when they almost kill us, shouldn't we correct them harshly?
It's the natural assumption. When Hoover approached the mechanic, the guy was weeping. Hoover had every justification to destroy his career.
But he didn't.
He put his arm around the mechanic and said, "To show you I'm sure that you'll never do this again, I want you to service my plane tomorrow."
It's shocking. But let's break down why it works better. If Hoover screamed at him, the mechanic's brain would link the trauma to Hoover. He'd become defensive or a nervous liability.
By extending trust in that specific moment, Hoover preserved the mechanic's core feeling of importance.
While ensuring lifelong loyalty and zero future mistakes.
Hurting people actively degrades their potential.
Okay, so if criticism is toxic, what is the actual high-performance fuel? How do we feed the engine?
The antidote to criticism is sincere appreciation.
Let's look at Charles Schwab, the first person to earn $1 million salary back in 1921. That's over $3,000 a day.
In an era of scientific management where laborers were viewed as interchangeable cogs.
And Schwab admitted he wasn't a technical genius. His secret was, "I am anxious to praise but loath to find fault."
It's contrary to our default settings. The average manager operates on a negative feedback loop. If someone does it right, we say nothing. If they do it wrong, we yell.
John D. Rockefeller used the positive lever when his partner Edward Bedford lost $1 million on a bad investment in South America.
Rockefeller could have crucified him.
But he knew Bedford did his best. So Rockefeller searched for a metric to praise. He found out Bedford salvaged a portion of the investment.
He congratulated Bedford for saving 60% of the capital.
Think about the psychological safety that creates. Bedford expects to be fired, and instead, the most powerful man in the world validates his competence.
And this mechanism isn't restricted to corporate titans. Take the story of Stevie Wonder.
Oh, this is incredible. His teacher in Detroit had a mouse escape in the classroom. She couldn't find it.
So she asked her blind student to help her find it.
She understood that nature gave him a remarkably sensitive auditory capacity. She made him feel indispensable.
And Stevie Wonder later said that specific act of appreciation was the inflection point of his life.
But we perpetually take the people closest to us for granted. There's a story of a husband asked by his wife to list 6 ways she could improve for a church program.
A psychological minefield.
A total trap. He admitted it would be easy to list 6 flaws. But instead, he sent 6 red roses to her with a note saying he loved her exactly as she was.
By refusing to criticize and deploying unprompted appreciation, he fundamentally altered their emotional baseline.
But I need to introduce a massive caveat here. I can hear a listener thinking, okay, I just need to flatter people constantly to get what I want.
That is the crucial distinction. We are not advocating for manipulation. Flattery is counterfeit. It's shallow and self-serving.
Humans can detect hidden agendas.
Exactly. General Obregon said, "Be afraid of the friends who flatter you." Flattery originates from the teeth out. Appreciation originates from the heart out.
Pamela Dunham, a supervisor in Connecticut, demonstrated this. She managed a janitor whose work was terrible and attitude was worse. The team mocked him.
She tried pressuring him, lecturing him. Nothing worked.
Until she noticed he did an exceptionally thorough job on one minor task, and she publicly praised him for it in front of the staff.
She validated him.
And it rewired his behavior. That single drop of appreciation gave him a reputation to live up to. He started executing all his duties with pride.
So we've established that appreciation is the fuel. But what if you need them to actually do something?
Right. Appreciation makes them feel good, but it doesn't mobilize them.
You can't mobilize someone by talking about what you want.
There's that fishing analogy. I love strawberries and cream, but if I go fishing, I bait the hook with worms. Why? Because fish want worms.
We constantly bait the hook with strawberries when persuading people. We talk about our quotas and our desires.
Ralph Waldo Emerson learned this the hard way. He and his son were trying to force a stubborn calf into a barn. Emerson pushing, the son pulling.
Brute force based on their own desires.
The calf just anchored itself. Then the Irish housemaid comes over, puts her finger in the calf's mouth, and lets it suckle while she gently leads it inside.
She aligned the action with the subject's internal drive. You have to identify their underlying hunger.
Like Stan Novak, whose son Tim was refusing to start kindergarten, throwing a full-blown meltdown.
Instinct says to drag the child to school.
But Stan engaged his cognitive empathy. He and his wife started enthusiastically finger-painting at the kitchen table.
Modeling the intrinsic rewards of kindergarten.
Tim stops crying, begs to participate, and the dad says, "Oh, no, you have to go to kindergarten first to learn how to finger paint."
He transformed the school into a barrier to something the boy desperately wanted.
The next morning, Tim was asleep in a chair, fully dressed, overwhelmed with an eager want to go to school.
Dale Carnegie used this to negotiate his hotel ballroom rent. The manager suddenly increased the rent by 300%.
Most people would storm in and complain about their own profit margins.
Which triggers the manager's defensive ego.
But Carnegie walked in with a paper, drawing an advantages and disadvantages column for the hotel manager. He said, "Advantage: your ballroom is free for higher-paying dances. Disadvantage: you lose my rent entirely, and you lose the thousands of cultured professionals my lectures bring into your hotel as free advertising."
He secured a concession without ever saying, "I want."
The manager dropped the increase to 50%. Henry Ford said the secret of success is seeing things from the other person's angle.
But corporations constantly fall into the me trap.
Like the radio station letter that kept saying, "Our company desires to retain its premier position." The recipient is internally screaming, "I do not care about your desires."
Contrast that with Barbara Anderson, who needed to relocate to Phoenix for her son's health. She didn't write to banks saying, "I'm a desperate mother, please hire me."
She wrote outlining her banking expertise and how it could contribute to their profit margins. 11 out of 12 banks invited her for an interview. But wait, isn't this selfish manipulation if I'm figuring out what they want just to get them to do what I want?
The difference between manipulation and leadership is mutual gain. Manipulation is a zero-sum game.
Like in the hotel negotiation, both parties profited.
Exactly. Look at Michael Whidden, the Shell oil salesman. He had a gas station manager whose facility was chronically filthy, hurting sales.
Instead of threatening him, Whidden invited him to ride along to a pristine, brand-new Shell station.
He let the manager observe the high traffic and prestige. The manager voluntarily overhauled his own station. Sales skyrocketed, and the manager increased his own income and pride.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've baited the hook. But before someone lets you do that, they have to drop their guard. They have to actually like you.
To bypass that skepticism, you have to be the dog.
I love this framing. A cow produces milk, a hen lays eggs, but a dog doesn't produce anything. It just gives unconditional love and genuine interest.
Carnegie states, you can make more friends in 2 months by being interested in others than in 2 years by trying to make them interested in you.
The NY telephone company studied thousands of phone calls to find the most used word. It was I. When you look at a group photo, you look for yourself first.
So we have to flip the script. Howard Thurston, the famous illusionist, did this.
Other magicians would peek through the curtain and call the audience suckers.
Thurston would stand in the wings and whisper, I love my audience. I am profoundly grateful they paid to see me.
And the audience felt that warmth. It works in corporate settings, too. Edward Sykes, a J&J salesman, had his account severed by a drugstore owner.
So he went back just to clarify policies.
And on his way to the office, he cheerfully greeted the soda jerk and the sales clerk, treating them with basic dignity.
The owner witnessed this, invited him in, and doubled his usual order.
Because the soda clerk defended Sykes, pointing out he was the only rep who treated the frontline staff well.
Likability is an actionable behavior, and it's physically encoded in a genuine smile.
The phone power training mandated that operators actively smile while speaking.
Even though the customer can't see them.
Right, because smiling physically alters the resonance of the voice. Professor James McConnell said there's vastly more information in a smile than a frown.
Robert Cryer recruited an elite PhD candidate away from larger firms simply because his voice sounded genuinely thrilled on the phone.
And beyond smiling, there's a specific linguistic trigger. A person's name. It's the sweetest sound in any language.
The reticular activating system filters out noise, but your name bypasses it instantly. Jim Farley used this to put FDR in the White House.
He knew 50,000 first names. He would memorize lists of attendees before train stops and greet everyone by name.
Andrew Carnegie discovered this as a boy with his rabbits. He couldn't afford food for them, so he promised neighborhood kids he'd name the bunnies after them if they foraged for clover.
And decades later, he built a massive steel mill and named it the Edgar Thomson Steel Works after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad.
So when Thomson needed steel rails, where do you think he bought them?
From the facility bearing his name. He did the same with George Pullman to merge their sleeping car companies. He suggested calling the new entity the Pullman Palace Car Company.
He completely subordinated his own ego.
People say they're too busy to remember names, but FDR took time during a global depression to learn the first names of the mechanics who built his car.
So you've got your foot in the door. How do you maintain that connection? You have to master conversation. And the irony is, it means talking less.
The illusion of the great talker. Carnegie sat next to a botanist at a dinner party. He knew nothing about botany, but listened with rapt attention for hours.
Barely spoke a word.
And the botanist called him a most interesting conversationalist.
Harvard President Charles W. Eliot said, exclusive attention to the speaker is the most flattering thing you can do. Listening with the mind and eyes.
It's a diffusal mechanism, too. The NY telephone company had a vicious customer who cursed and filed lawsuits. They sent a troubleshooter who just listened for hours over 4 visits.
The customer eventually paid his bills and dropped the lawsuits because he finally got the feeling of importance he was desperately seeking.
Lincoln did this during the Civil War. He called an old friend from Illinois to Washington just to talk at him for hours about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Didn't ask for advice. He just needed a sympathetic ear.
But when you do speak, you must talk in their interests. Edward Chalif needed a Boy Scout trip funded by a major executive.
So he researched the man and found out he once wrote $1 million check and framed it.
Chalif walks in and says, "I heard you wrote $1 million check. I want to see it." He validates the executive's monument to himself.
The executive talks about it for 20 minutes, then ends up funding 5 boys to go to Europe.
The Connecticut attorney did this too. He admired an elderly woman's antique house and her memories. She felt so valued, she gave him her late husband's vintage Packard car.
Refusing to give it to her greedy relatives, James Adamson won a $90,000 contract from George Eastman just by admiring the English oak in Eastman's office.
Okay, this is a robust framework. But what happens when you hit inevitable conflict? How do we navigate that without destroying the relationship?
The first prerequisite is to shatter the illusion that you can win an argument.
Carnegie learned this at a London banquet. A man attributed a Shakespeare quote to the Bible. Carnegie aggressively corrected him.
His friend kicked him under the table and agreed with the wrong man.
And his friend later said, "Why prove to a man he is wrong? Is that going to make him like you? Let him save face."
You literally cannot win an argument. If you win the logic, you lose the person. Ben Franklin realized his arrogant debating style made him a pariah.
So he forbade himself from using words like certainly or undoubtedly.
Replacing them with "I conceive" or "I imagine."
Contrast that with the lawyer who corrected a Supreme Court justice on a point of admiralty law. The lawyer was right, but the temperature in the room dropped to 0. He lost the persuasion.
Never say, "I'm going to prove this to you." It's a psychological challenge. Instead, if you know you're in the wrong, beat them to the punch. Emphatically condemn yourself.
The park policeman and the unmuzzled dog. Carnegie was caught letting his bulldog off the leash after a warning. Before the cop could lecture him, Carnegie shouted, "I am entirely guilty. I have no excuses."
And the cop's posture instantly shifted. He was deprived of righteous indignation, so he actually started making excuses for Carnegie.
The cop adopted the role of the merciful authority figure.
Robert E. Lee did this after Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. He didn't blame his commanders. He rode out and said, "All this has been my fault."
But isn't admitting fault like showing your neck to a predator? Won't people take advantage of that?
The empirical evidence says no. Admitting fault creates a cognitive vacuum. Bruce Harvey made a massive payroll error.
He authorized full pay for someone on unpaid leave.
He walked into his director's office and said, "I made a catastrophic mistake. It is entirely my fault." The director tried to blame HR, then the software, but Harvey insisted it was his own fault.
Deflated the director entirely.
Ferdinand Warren did the same with the toxic, hypercritical art director. He walked in and said, "If what you're about to say is true, I am entirely at fault and ashamed of myself."
He stole the director's script. The director ended up defending Warren and took him out to lunch.
It clears the air of defensiveness and pivots to collaborative problem solving.
So to recap this massive journey, human craving for importance drives society. Replace criticism with sincere appreciation. Bait the hook to suit the fish.
Actively listen, validate their interests, and gracefully avoid arguments through epistemic humility and self-condemnation.
But what is the ultimate takeaway for the listener to internalize?
Carnegie notes we only use a fraction of our resources. Think about George Dyke, this 72-year-old fiddle scraper who found immense joy just by being genuinely interested in the younger musicians around him.
He rewrote his own ending.
What if the friction you experience at work or home isn't a symptom of a cold world, but a reflection of an untapped superpower? The power to transform your environment is waiting for you to ask someone a single genuine question about themselves.
That is a phenomenal perspective. True human engineering requires warmth and laying down your own ego. So go out there, leave a trail of sincere appreciation, and see what catches fire. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.